Mr. Ambassador, ladies and gentlemen, I'm to play the part of an economist. And I was very much impressed by what you said as a plaidoyer for open, free global trade. But it is not necessarily a plaidoyer for bilateral trade. So my main point, which I would like to raise is, and I was very pleased to know that you have been on the administration of President Clinton in the early 90s, when there was the Blair House Agreement, which of course was, the starting point for the end of the Uruguay round. But with hindsight, we know that the Blair House Agreement got effects which minimize the benefits for the third countries. And all what we know about calculations on third country effects and the effects for the member countries was that the Blair House Agreement was basically in favor of the two parties, which of course did this agreement. And the Uruguayan round was saved. But we know from countries like China, India, Brazil, that they have never forgotten that this was around an agreement not necessarily to their benefit. At least that is what we understand it. And their plaidoyer is, it will never happen again. So we have to be very, very careful not to repeat, let's say, the traps and the weaknesses of a Blair House Agreement in the early 90s. We say there should be non-discrimination at the forefront of the negotiations. I think that is a very important point. I would not deny the big benefits for trade, welfare, and income of the TTIP agreement, because by far it is the largest, and the discrimination effect, what we economists call the trade diversion effect, is necessarily, of course, relatively small, but it exists, because the more dynamic trading partners are outside this group, vis-à-vis emerging markets. And this is why I'm very strongly in favor of a non-discrimination clause in which maybe a third party, maybe the WTO, would also be part of the negotiations in order to take the interests of the non-member countries. I think that would, of course, be very helpful because at the same time, we still have the ongoing negotiations on the Doha round. And only, let's say, 30 kilometers of here, 6 years ago, we had a group of 4 countries, US, EU, Brazil, and India. And we were very close to a Doha agreement at that time in Potsdam in August 2008. It failed not because of controversies between the US and the EU. It failed because of controversies on agriculture between India and the US. And of course, we should try to avoid such a trap. Because at the very end, we will still have a target, not to say, okay, the Doha round is in coma and we would like to finish it or without any agreement, but we would also have a Doha agreement to a conclusive role and to a successful conclusion. That's my first point. The second point is the degree of ambitiousness in the agreements. You mentioned, of course, it is highly ambitious. We are entering uncharted territory. Trade in electronic trade with electronic signatures, and so on and so on. So the problem is, of course, that if it is too ambitious, we are facing the risk to be trapped in what we call the single undertaking problem in the Doha round. That means nothing is decided unless everything is decided. That is a big risk. And in my concern, in my view, it would be more realistic to head for a perhaps less ambitious TTIP. Maybe a simple free trade agreement, Article 24, but of course it includes trade in services, it would be also Article 5 GATS. But if it's too ambitious, we are facing really a problem of capacities in negotiations, at the same time Doha, eagerly ambitious, and of course TTIP. And if the time frame is too long, you know, we are negotiating Doha for more than 10 years, I think the momentum will be lost. Because all the arguments you raise, the cross-border value-added chains, the gains to the consumers, and so on, they're all, of course, available from the global trade, sure. because the cross-border value-added chains do not care about transatlantic or trans-Pacific. That, of course, would say, hey, do not forget we have another trading round going on. We should not, of course, minimize now our efforts to come across with this agreement and everything put on the TTIP. At the same time, you have TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which is, say, in terms of negotiations, a bit ahead, but in which, of course, especially the labor and the environmental standards play a much better, greater role, especially the labor standards, as in the transatlantic case, because we are at the similar income level. That is the second concern. So the maximum of ambitiousness is not a good thing. It would be an optimum. Maybe what we say, okay, why not going step by step, having the, say, low-hanging fruits, early harvest gains early, because otherwise it's really difficult. And I think the degree of ambitiousness is also the problem that so many different cooks, of course, are adding to the recipe. The European Parliament, the NGOs, Capitol Hill, and so on, the difficulties of getting a fast track, the Trade Promotion Authority, and so on and so on. So less ambitious means maybe earlier results and better results. My final point is referring to the standards. I'm not caring now about, of course, the agricultural standards, the SPS agreement, in which, of course, these standards play a big role, and we have all these problems already in the WTO dispute settlement mechanism. But my concern is that we set up standards which so far do not exist, for instance, in trade and services. This is, again, uncharted territory. And the question, of course, again is, can we bring these standards to a level which is acceptable to countries from the emerging world, from India, from Brazil? And these countries are concerned. Again, the similarities to Blair House come to the minds of these countries, saying, okay, they are setting rules, and we only have to accept that. Now, these problems are larger in the Trans-Pacific Agreement because many countries do not have these standards, whereas in Europe and the US we have standards, and of course the question is of harmonization ex post or ex ante. So cutting the whole story short, the bilateral agreement is still second best. The first best is a multilateral agreement. Number two is it might be too ambitious and therefore would take too much time, the single undertaking problem which we have observed from the Doha round problem. And the third point is with respect to the standards, the question is, can we agree on what we call mutual recognition, subject to a common minimum standard, which would be good, especially in agricultural trade? And the final point is, and the concerns, you raised the concerns, and the concerns in Europe, as I understand it, is that the initiative for the TTIP came not from the US, from the EU, but basically from the US. President Obama announced, or has a target, to double exports from the level of 2010, 2015. So a very strong impact on exports. And it would be good to hear the same, of course, on the import side, because that is absolutely relevant. So the concern in Europe is such an initiative, basically driven from the US, meets Europe at a point where we have still not mastered the crisis in some Euro countries. And our concern is, and I think maybe that this is also apart from the discussion, open floor discussion, is that such agreement could drive a further wedge into North Euro and South European countries, Euro countries, at a time when we have not yet really mastered our internal problems. Okay, I think this is just a few thoughts for the discussion, and thank you so much.
If I have the opportunity, thank you for that. You know, I guess a couple of thoughts. On the Blair House Agreement dynamic, you know, let's not forget, you know, China became a member of the WTO sometime afterwards, so they weren't necessarily around to be a player at that point in time. But after the Uruguay round of the GATT, the global trading, you know, family, if you will, expanded dramatically. So, but I guess I have a couple things. First of all, as you noted, you have TTIP, which addresses part of the world, and we have the Doha round. And I would remind folks here that the Uruguay round of the GATT was dead in the water until Bill Clinton was able to successfully get NAFTA through Congress. Nobody ever thought that would happen because of such incredible opposition from organized labor and others in the United States to NAFTA. But he was able to get it through Congress. And after that, the Uruguay round of the GATT was completed in 4 months. So I actually would hope that what might happen here is if we are able to successfully conclude TTIP, you'll see a re-energizing of the Doha round and sort of get to that global, everybody in situation that you're talking about. On the ambition, I hear you on that. Here's my concern about that. If you just do the easy stuff, you'll never get to the hard stuff. And in some respects, the hard stuff is more important, or very important. In some instances, more important. So I think we've got to, and you can't walk into a negotiation, and I've said this to some, friends of mine who are Germans who are in the press saying, oh gosh, we can't do sanctions because it'll be terrible for us and with the gas imported from Russia. You don't walk into a negotiation or a discussion and take things off the table before you even walk in the door. So let's try to be ambitious, but then let's also be realistic about it. Because while the negotiators have all talked about the depth and the breadth of TTIP and how ambitious they want to be, they also say we're not going to let chlorinated chicken, basically tank this thing. So, so I think there'll be a push for as much as you can get, and then I think at some point there'll be a real politic, answer to this. But we're just getting to the hard stuff, so I think it would probably be too early to go. And a piecemeal thing, believe me, you can't. It's hard enough to get one of these things through the United States Congress. I don't think you want to keep going back and back and back with additional rounds. You want to get as much done as you can as quickly as possible. And then finally on standards, I guess my concern there is what I'm hearing as a European concern is that there not be a race to the bottom. We've got the U.S. and the EU are level one countries when it comes to regulation and standards of consumer protection and health and safety protection and labor and environmental protection. And one of the concerns is, well, gosh, this is going to be a race to the bottom. And we're saying, well, actually, no, it's not. It's going to be more of a harmonization of standards, making things, that'll ultimately reduce prices and create greater choice for consumers. But I fear that if we go in with a lowest common denominator approach, you'll never get it through the European Parliament, and you'll lose a lot of support in the United States Congress as well because of a fear that that's exactly what we're doing. And I think that you do have the Doha round that's continuing, and I think the hope would be that ultimately, as we increase prosperity around the world, that also we will increase the labor and the environmental and the health and safety standards around the world as well. So those are my comments on that.
Would you like to comment?
Comment on my comments?
Yes. Well, very briefly, according to the standards, the standard problem is basically a problem in the Trans-Pacific, not so much in the European transatlantic US negotiations, simply because the standards are very much different in the Trans-Pacific. Here's the concern in the Trans-Pacific, and of course there's a link between the two agreements, because on the Trade Promotion Authority issue. Here, the Asian countries fear that standards are used by the US as a protectionist device, which, of course, is not true. We have the same debate also, of course, with respect to other developing countries in Europe. But anyway, of course, for the standards, the best is mutual recognition. That would be the best. Unfortunately, the EU is very much in favor of ex-ante harmonization, which, of course, is very cumbersome and, very bureaucratic. With respect to the changing world since Blair House, my second comment, of course you are right. 2001 was the entry of China in the WTO, and what of course was 10 years later after Blair House Agreement was orchestrated. The problem is, of course, that these countries fear, and this is just, again, something for the discussion, that it fear that all the issues which have to do with trade, for instance, manipulation of exchange rates, the old Chinese-US problem, will come into this agreement, and the US will try to form a coalition in this respect, in the macroeconomics and the global imbalances debate, against the emerging markets. That should be excluded. I think it should be crystal clear that we are dealing basically with trade and investment, and of course with the investment protection mechanisms, right? But we are not interfering to what we call the macroeconomics and the exchange rate manipulation, beggar my neighbor policy, and so on. So I think that is a concern which I'm often in emerging markets, especially in Asia, which I hear from my Asian colleagues say, can you exclude that the US is not dragging the EU into this boat of, let's say, an aggressive stance against countries which perhaps for some time manipulate the exchange rate? So that is my concern.
Thanks.
I think I would like to come back to the topic of Renaissance. And we discussed so far very much the trade component of it and the economics of the Renaissance. And in a moment, we'll open it up for your questions, and you can ask questions as they relate to TTIPs and other matters. But there's more to a Renaissance than just trade. And listening to the ambassador's speech, various points came to mind. Security policy was mentioned, the current situation in the Ukraine and Russia, but other security issues as well that might involve Europe, not as the front player, but certainly a very important party involved. Think about it, border disputes between China and Japan at the moment. Even though they seem far away, the implications are not. Then, in this part of the world, we all are concerned about what some have called the rollback of democracy. Democracy is not having a very good time at the moment in Europe. And what does that mean for the renaissance of European, US-German relations? Should we build, propagate democracy, defend it, roll back the rollback? So there are various parts of the renaissance that could come if we have a democracy agenda, independent of the trade agenda. And one could mention others, environmental policy. The one I would like to focus on in my very, very brief comments, and I'll end with a question, in fact, has to do with the NSA and related, and I call it this NSA syndrome. We had here at the Hertie School, as we do every year, in December, a contest where we come together with a leading daily, Handelsblatt, and select the personalities of the year. And for the first time this year, we asked the students at the Hertie School to vote, right? Or to elect the personality of the year, and I'm sure...
I can guess who won.
I don't even have to give you three guesses. I won, and you know the person I'm talking about. See, and I wonder, why do I bring it up?
Pope Francis. No.
How do we? So we have this disconnect between a data protection security dialogue in the United States and certainly in much of Europe, particularly in this country. And you commented in your speech on what has happened just the last few days, and when you met Foreign Minister Steinmeier and John Kerry, that you brought this up, and this balance between Sicherheit and Freiheit, you mentioned those names. But if you have this disconnect, culturally deeply embedded, different conceptions about what security means and what data protection, what liberty means, how can you find that balance? How can you find that common ground? And as I said, I would end on the question because I don't have the answer, but perhaps you do.
Okay. It's, I'm not sure I have the answer, but I have some observations. Observation number one is that there are historic and cultural differences between Americans and Germans in terms of their view of technology and in particular their view of surveillance. The historical differences derive from the fact that in Germany there were 50 years of terrible oppression of the German people by governments through use of terrorizing surveillance techniques, both the Third Reich and the Stasi situation, which were, and even for those who, came of age at the tail end or even after the fall of the wall, with the opening of the Stasi files, it just sort of rubbed salt in the wounds of people who learned that colleagues and even some instances family members and even children were in effect reporting on them. Whereas in America, we've never had that history of government use of these kinds of activities to oppress its own people. There are some isolated instances, as President Obama said in his speech, where the FBI was spying on Martin Luther King and some leaders of the civil rights movement. But in terms of a wholesale ethic or whatever of this, never existed in the United States. And on top of that, in America, for every American over the age of 15, they have seared in their memory images that they've seen over and over and over of airplanes flying into buildings, shoe bombers, underwear bombers, marathon bombers, SUVs left parked in Times Square filled with explosive, which thank God didn't go off because the detonator didn't work. And so point number one, from a historical standpoint, it's important to understand that you can have two people who do share the same basic values about freedom and democracy, but reach slightly different comfort levels as to what the right balance is between freedom and security because of the fact that they live through different sets of experiences. Second point is cultural. What's the first thing that an American will say to you when you show them Google Street View? Oh, cool. Can I see my house? Well, you all know that's not the first thing a German says. First thing a German says is, oh my God, how did you get that on there? How can I get it off? And literally, go to Google Street View in Germany and you'll see pixelation after pixelation because people have actually gone on to get their houses removed. So there's just a basic cultural difference in terms of the view of technology. We were talking about this morning. The U.S. Embassy here, we have a Facebook page. It's actually pretty good. But on a proportional level, we've got a lower, it's not even a European issue. It's much more a German issue, a lower number of friends than, and this was before the NSA thing even broke, than proportionally any other country in Western Europe. I mean, there's just, whether it's a suspicion or a cultural distrust or whatever, that exists in the country. That's the second point. The third point, and this gets to the issue of safety and security and all. The third point is one of the problems that we face is that when Snowden started, when he kind of popped on the screen and all these disclosures started coming out, initially it was about metadata, which is an effort to look at bits of information and match them up and see if there are any connections between known terrorist networks and individuals' phone calls or whatever. And then if there are, you actually go to court and the FISA courts and in effect get a search warrant to go and look at the content, to query the content. But there was a lot of concern, both in the United States, I might add, and in Germany about all this data. What happened is when the allegation or the disclosure about the chancellor's cell phone broke, everybody conflated the two. And the mind's eye went to, remember that great film, The Lives of Others? That, somebody's sitting there listening to everybody's phone calls and reading their emails and all that. Well, we don't have 30,000 fluent-speaking Germans listening in. The metadata situation is something where you're looking for a needle in a haystack, and you just throw in straw like this, and then you find the needle, you examine it. You don't examine every piece of straw. And a challenge we have is to try to deconstruct those two things. And I have made very clear that any allegation or listening to the chancellor's cell phone has absolutely nothing to do, obviously, with dealing with terrorism. And as President Obama has said, if I want to know what Chancellor Merkel is thinking, I pick up the phone and I call her. And that's how all of us operate in the embassy with our counterparts. But the two have gotten mixed up and confused, and so I think that has led to a problem. And then the final issue is it's complex. I mean, and that's why I do think it's very important for us to have, and the Hertie Institute might be a place to do this. The Hertie School might be a place to do this, but to have a thoughtful conversation about what is the meaning of privacy in the digital age. And, but also to do it with a recognition of the fact that there are people out there who want to harm us or at minimum disrupt us and they're very sophisticated at using technology to recruit and to train and to plan and to carry out attacks. And I'm not just talking about, what you think of as terrorist attacks, a bomb in a grocery store or something like that. I'm thinking about cyber attacks on our air traffic control systems, on our financial networks, and our energy grid systems, which literally happen almost on a daily basis. And from the standpoint of technology security, it's really important that we continue to work together, because we have been working together to stay one step ahead or at least abreast of these folks and what they're doing. That's my answer.
Thank you. Actually, let's open it up for questions and comments from the audience. I would like to ask you briefly introduce who you are and then state the question and try to be succinct so we get as many people involved as possible. We have movable mics around there, and there's the gentleman right there and the gentleman behind you. And we typically take 2 or 3 of these questions at a time.
Ambassador, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. Just a follow-up question on the last one. I noticed, being a lawyer, that rule of law is very important as a shared value. There is a cultural element in law, I accept that too, but I don't think it would be a good idea or a good answer from somebody who infringes copyright in China to say in China we have a completely different cultural attitude towards copyright. It isn't going to work like that. So there are limits also what you can do with law and privacy and snooping. We see that there is quite a gulf, and I think it's a challenge for the very important transatlantic relationship to bridge that. But there are also default lines. And one of the default lines are the Vienna Conventions on diplomatic and consular relationships. And the other is you can do on your soil what you want, but you have to respect the laws of the country where you operate. I just wonder, is the United States government in a position to confirm that will not use its government employees and government contractors to commit criminal offenses on German soil?
The gentleman back there, yeah. Yeah, it's right there.
Thank you. My name is Marek Slobodnik. I'm here from the Hertie School. I have a question more towards security and politics. With the Russian reset and pivot to Asia, many in Central Europe have felt that the Obama administration has overlooked Central Europe in the transatlantic relationship. And now with the events in Crimea, my question is, Mr. Ambassador, will there be a change in America's relations with Central and Eastern Europe? And if so, how specifically will that look? Thank you.
Can we take one more question? This is the gentleman right here. Let's move the mic to the second row. Yeah, it's coming. Yeah. And then we take a second round after that.
Good afternoon, Mr. Ambassador. My name is Mr. Nana, Cody Nana from the U.S. Democrats Abroad, Germany, chapter Berlin. I would like to know, what do you think about now the concerning problems with Crimea Island and the G7 problem that Obama has yesterday thought on CNN clearly that he was suspending Russia temporarily for several months, and the French foreign minister did it the same, but Chancellor Merkel told yesterday afternoon in the conference with the Portuguese Prime Minister they have only suspended for a month but not for long term Russia, and what will the definite solution about the sanctions with Russia, and when China is now on the side with the United States and Japan too, because China and Russia, they don't have nice close relationships. A lot of people thinking Russia could sell the oil and the gas in the Chinese market, but it wouldn't be so easy. And my next question is, did you think that the treatment between the transatlantic treatment for the United States and the European Union would come to an ratification from the Congress and from the United States Senate at the Obama administration, or would be that during a long term in the next presidency after Obama administration? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so we got 4 questions. You got 2 of them. You got 2. First of all, on the question of criminality, I'm not going to sit here and opine onto what's a criminal offense or not a criminal offense under German law. That's certainly not my expertise. I haven't looked at it. I will tell you that the American and the German intelligence services have a very close working relationship, closely coordinate. One of the things that they're working on now is the problem of people who become radicalized in Germany or in other countries in Europe and then go through using the Schengen rules, transit up and then into Syria, and there's been some press about this, and then fight in Syria, get even more radicalized, learn skills that they can then bring back, and then come back into Germany and other parts of Europe. These are the kinds of things that it's really important for us to continue to work together on, and those are that's what we're talking about. You know, is working together to protect people here, people in other parts of Europe. You know, unfortunately, it's the world in which we live. And, you know, I've heard a lot of, you know, talk about, you know, concern about, you know, well, you know, spying and industrial espionage and so on and so forth. The one thing I can make clear, because the president has said it and the director of the NSA has said it, that, and despite this has been in the press, an accusation by Mr. Snowden, we absolutely do not engage in industrial espionage. What we do, and that is basically stealing secrets from firms so we can advantage American firms in bidding processes or stealing intellectual property or whatever. What we do, and this is what the economic division of every embassy in the world does, is we look at economic trends, we analyze sectors, we analyze industries, we do research on companies within industries that are major players. Much of that just so we can understand what's happening in the economies. That information gets fed back to things like central banks. Much of that is actually made public. Some of it is not. But it may well be that some of the disclosures pertain to what is, you know, generally understood as something that everybody does, of trying to get this collective economic information, and then people are jumping to the conclusion of industrial espionage. So I wanted to make clear that would be illegal under American law too, for sure. The second question, on the question of the Ukraine, and have we overlooked, who asked that back there? Have we overlooked Central Europe? You know what I get asked a lot these days? Wow, with the Ukraine, are we, you know, what's happened to the Mideast, or what's happened to Syria, or what's happened to, you know, and then before that it was with Syria, what's happened to, when Syria was, it was a hot front burner issue, people were concerned that we weren't doing anything to advance Middle East peace. I think part of the problem is that the press only has so much bandwidth of issues to cover. And I can just tell you, I've only been in this job for 7 months, but from day one, when I went through my briefings at the State Department, there was a great deal of focus and discussion and consultation on Eastern Europe, and a great deal of focus and attention being paid by the American government to Eastern Europe. So I wouldn't say that necessarily that President Obama overlooked Central and Eastern Europe. I would just say that it's now on the front pages of the paper because of what's happening there. But in point of fact, there was a great deal of attention being paid all along the way. And on the situation with the Crimea, there are two issues there, okay? Number one is that the United States and Germany and the EU are in full agreement that we've got to communicate to Russia that there are costs to violating agreements like the Budapest Accord and not respecting the territorial integrity of the Ukraine. And those costs include some level of economic cost and the costs of political isolation. And part of this whole G7 thing is about political isolation, obviously. And the fact is that Chancellor Merkel and President Obama and Kerry and Steinmeier, they've been shoulder to shoulder in this whole thing. And whether somebody says, well, it's a multi-month or a 1 month or three, that's nothing compared. I mean, fundamentally, they are absolutely shoulder to shoulder and on the same track and going down the same path in terms of dealing with this situation, which I might add is changing like by the moment. I mean, I gave a speech yesterday. Somebody asked me about the Ukraine. I said, well, right now, President Putin's giving a speech to, the Russian Duma. What I'm saying now might be, irrelevant in an hour. So it's a very fast-changing thing, but that's where we are. And in terms of TTIP and your concern or your question about whether it would be approved in an Obama administration or in a future administration, on the one level, this kind of gets to your thing about ambition, we don't want to impose a time limit on TTIP, because if you do a time limit, then what people like to do, one of my favorite phrases is people like to outslow you. They'll just kind of drag their heels and then, well, I guess we never got to that issue. And so the reality is that there's a great window of opportunity before the 2016 presidential election and congressional elections get full throttle underway. It really goes into the early spring of 2016. There would be an opportunity to get something like this done through Congress. And the whole comment about one tank of gas and all that is, suggests that there's a desire to get this done during this administration. However, you've read in the paper that there are concerns with getting TPA, the Trade Promotion Authority, which is necessary to get any kind of a treaty through the Senate, through Congress. But fundamentally, if there's a good agreement, you're going to get TPA. But if there's not a good agreement, they're not necessarily going to bring it up either. So, I mean, the first step is to get a good agreement. And then if that happens, I think the rest will take care of itself. But getting trade agreements through Congress, which is something I've got some real world experience in. I mean, these things kind of have an ebb and a flow to them in terms of the way they operate. But the hope would certainly be to get it done during the Obama administration.
Professor Langhammer, do you think this is a realistic assessment?
Well, we have midterm elections and do not know the outcome, of course. What I heard from American colleagues is, let's assume, of course, Republicans would get a majority in the two houses, then it might be easier to get a TPA than, let's say, still divided between the Senate and the House of Representatives. I do not know. I'm not a political scientist. But what concerns us is, of course, that the resistance against TPA comes from the Democrats. Harry Reid and so on and so on. Maybe it has more to do with TPP, with the Trans-Pacific. But the two, of course, are intertwined. You can't separate the TPP with respect to the Trade Promotion Authority from the TTIP. So that is I'm skeptical, must say. But
well, in terms of trade politics, you always start with a group of moderate Democrats, moderate Republicans, and you work out from that. And the opposition is typically the far right and the far left, who come together, kind of an unholy alliance. And we had Ralph Nader and Pat Buchanan fighting us in GATT, and sort of building up from that end. And the name of the game is to sort of move out from that center as far as you can in both parties. But typically, you're going to have 60% of the, I'm making this up, but I think this is about right, thinking back to both NAFTA and GATT, 60 to 65% of the vote was Republicans, and 35 to 40% of the vote was Democrats. But there, I also think that, Harry Reid, with his recent comments, his past comments have been supportive of TTIP. He has been a past supporter of trade agreements. I think his recent comments is also a recognition this thing is not going to be negotiated before the 2014 elections, and why have a big bloody battle over something before, in the wake of as we're leading up to these midterms. But obviously it's not for me to, comment on what he's thinking, but I do know that in the past he has been supportive of these things. So, but you're always going to have more Republicans than Democrats typically in supporting these things and getting them through Congress.
In any case, it's going to be a very, very number of interesting months coming our way when it comes to trade negotiations, but also in what you said earlier, when it comes to the discussion about what do we do now in the aftermath of the NSA affair or crisis, whatever you might call it. And what I find interesting is that there are so many moving parts in this discussion at the moment. If you widen it a bit, this week we heard what I thought was fascinating news coming from the United States, that ICANN is going to be redesigned, right? And it's very, very important non-profit organization that sits in the Bay Area, I think, and it has had such an impact on the way the world is operating these days, right? Is being redesigned, and I think the U.S. the U.S. government is inviting suggestions on how to design it, how to make it a better system. Because you mentioned the internet, and that's an integral part of that. And then that relates again to issues of data security and protection and freedom of information and flow. So complexity is a word you used in your presentation. I think that's quite right. And I hope that here at the school we'll have an opportunity to continue that part of the debate. Maybe we can have a session on what should ICANN look like, and what is then the interface between ICANN and related governance structures for the internet and national security concerns.
I think it'd be very helpful.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
So I would like to take that as a task with us. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. So I'd like to bring this to a close. I'd like to thank, of course, the ambassador for coming. I'd like to thank Professor Langhammer for coming, and the staff from the embassy. It's always good to see you. And I'd like to thank the team here at the Hertie School who did a splendid job in organizing the Kiel lunch today. Thank you, everybody, and of course, you for coming.